I'm John, 35, and saying goodbye to my boring life, she wrote. She married her boss and left me humiliated, so I emptied our accounts and changed the locks. But the next morning I was standing in the hallway with my phone, buzzing from dozens of notifications, when a knock at the door sent a jolt through my chest, because I thought she'd come back early to scream and demand access to what she no longer owned. But instead, I found the wife of her boss standing there with calm eyes and a folder clutched tightly in her hand like she had been rehearsing her next move all night, and I realized I wasn't the only one betrayed and discarded like garbage. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop your location in the comments, because I want to see how far the story travels, and hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about rebuilding after betrayal, because what happened next will show you exactly why some storms are worth surviving no matter how much they destroy along the way. My life was quiet before all of this because I ran my own remodeling business, and most days my hands smelled like with glue or concrete dust, and I thought that was enough to hold my marriage together, because I believed hard work built strong foundations, but I was wrong, because I didn't see the cracks forming until a whole structure collapsed in one public act of humiliation that left me breathless with rage. I had spent 5 years believing we were partners, and in the early days she used to brag about how lucky she was to have a man who built things with his hands. But over time her compliments turned to criticisms, and every time she came home from another late meeting her eyes were full of stories about her boss and his ambitious projects, while I was left holding our small life together with little more than determination, and I hated that I started measuring my worth against a man I had never met, but whose name became the soundtrack of our house. When I confronted her about spending too many nights away, she accused me of being insecure and controlling, and she said real men supported their wives' careers instead of clinging to outdated ideas of marriage. And I remember standing in our kitchen, holding my work boots with cement still drying on them while she scrolled through her phone, and I felt like a relic from a world she had already left without telling me, and I can't forgive how she made me feel small in my own home like a guest. Overstaying is welcome. The betrayal didn't happen in a single moment because it was built over hundreds of small choices where she turned her back on me, and when she stopped sleeping in our bedroom and claimed my snoring kept her awake, I foolishly believed her even though I noticed she packed her favorite perfume every time she went on a trip for Company A, and when she returned there was always a new expensive item she brushed off as a gift from her team, which was a lie so thin even she seemed tired of telling it. I still remember our 5th anniversary approaching and how I convinced myself it would be the moment we reconnected, and I spent weeks carving a small wooden box with our initials because I thought a handmade gift could remind her of what we built, but when I handed it to her she smiled like a stranger thanking a cashier and placed it on the hallway table without opening it before asking if I could drive her to the mall for a new bag for her. Leadership retreat in City B, which she scheduled over our anniversary without asking, and I felt my stomach drop, because her priorities were no longer even pretending to include me. The week she left for that trip was the quietest our house had ever been, and I sat in the living room staring at her empty wine glass from the night before, as if it could explain where we went wrong. But I already knew because she had been preparing to leave long before Cancun, and I realized I had been keeping a corpse of marriage alive out of habit and fear. It was Thursday night when my phone lit up with her post, and my hand went cold as I read the caption she wrote under a photo of her in a white dress kissing her boss on a beach with colleagues cheering them on. And she said, "Marry my best friend today. Goodbye, boring life," and tagged me so that every client, friend, and relative would see my public execution. And my world tilted, because no one deserves to find out their marriage ended through an Instagram notification. That was the moment I stopped being her husband, because I became something else entirely. A man with nothing left to lose and nothing left to protect, and I decided that if she wanted war, I would give her one, because I would not be the victim in a story she was already rewriting to cast herself as the brave survivor of marriage she chose to destroy with her own hands. I woke up the next morning with my phone still in my hand, and my head pounding from the flood of notifications that hadn't stopped all night, because everyone who had ever known us was now a witness to the spectacle she created, and I couldn't escape the image of her kissing him while holding a champagne glass, as if the years we spent building a life meant nothing, and I couldn't understand how she thought it was acceptable to tag me in the moment. She destroyed everything I had believed about love and loyalty. I couldn't forget how quickly respect turned into contempt because I saw it in the way she spoke to me like a subordinate who couldn't possibly understand her new world, and I remembered the countless evenings she came home late claiming endless work demands, but scrolling her phone for hours without acknowledging my presence, and each time I swallowed my frustration because I told myself successful marriages require patience and forgiveness even when the sacrifices feel one-sided and suffocating. I spent years carrying the financial weight, while she reinvested her energy and affection into a job that consumed her completely, and I ignored how she mocked the simplicity of my work to her friends who visited and laughed about how I smelled of sawdust and paint, while her boss always smelled of imported cologne and ambition. And I should have known then that I was no longer her equal in her eyes because I had become the background noise in her pursuit of status. She had stopped touching me months before, and I thought it was stress, but now I see it was calculation, because she had already begun to detach from me emotionally and physically while keeping up just enough a facade to avoid suspicion until her exit plan was secure, and she never once asked me if I was happy in a marriage that had become a daily test of endurance instead of a partnership. The last family gathering we attended together was a silent warning I refused to hear because she spent the entire evening glued to her phone, and when my sister asked how her work was going, she lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. But when asked about our anniversary plan, she brushed it off and laughed that I was too busy fixing houses to plan anything special, and the room went quiet because everyone knew what I refused to accept, and I hate that I defended her even then. I had convinced myself our problems were temporary and that love was meant to survive seasons of distance, but I didn't realize she wasn't weathering the storm with me, but boarding another ship entirely. And each time I tried to talk about our future, she dismissed me with vague reassurances that meant nothing because her future no longer included me. She used my loyalty as a weapon against me because every act of kindness I gave her became another reason she felt superior, and every effort I made to hold us together was ammunition for her to claim I was desperate and needy while she sought validation from someone who didn't build anything real, but who offered her an escape from responsibility. And I can never forgive the way she turned my stability into a punchline. Even now, I can't believe I tolerated her sleeping in the guest room for over a year while she claimed she needed space, and I let her take it because I didn't want to pressure her, but the truth was she had already left our marriage, and I was too afraid to admit it, because admitting it meant facing the reality that I wasn't enough for the person I had chosen above everyone else. Every late-night call she took on the balcony that ended abruptly when I entered the room was another betrayal she stacked like bricks around her heart to keep me out, and every work trip she extended by a day or two was another rehearsal for the life she was planning with someone else, and I hate myself for excusing it all under the belief that strong marriages require sacrifice, even when that sacrifice becomes self-erasure. The night before she left for the leadership retreat, she didn't even bother saying goodbye, and I sat in the kitchen staring at the packed suitcase. She left by the door as if I didn't exist, and I realized too late that I had been reduced to a placeholder in her life, and my silence had only made it easier for her to leave without a trace of guilt because she convinced herself I was holding her back when I had done nothing but stand by her through every rise and fall. I decided I couldn't let our 5th anniversary pass without trying one last time to remind her the life we promised each other, because I still believe that love deserved at least one final chance, even though every sign around me screamed she no longer cared. And I told myself that if I didn't fight for us, I would regret it forever, even though deep down, I already knew the fight was over. I made a reservation at the only place that had ever mattered to us because it was where I had asked her to marry me with shaking hands and a hopeful heart. And I thought if I could get her to sit across from me in that place, maybe she would remember who we were before ambition poisoned her mind and before her boss became the center of every conversation in our house. I spent the day before rehearsing what I would say, and I carved another small gift because I believed something handmade would carry more weight than anything money could buy, and I told myself she would see the effort and realize I was still the same man who would do anything to make her feel loved and valued. But the truth was I had been reduced to a man begging for scraps of attention from someone who no longer respected me. When I told her about the reservation, she barely looked up from her laptop and muttered something about being busy with presentations and meetings, and she reminded me she was flying out for the retreat the next morning, as if our anniversary was just another inconvenient event she hadn't penciled into her calendar. And I stood there holding the small wooden box in my hands like an idiot while she scrolled her phone and ignored me completely. I still went to the restaurant because I couldn't bring myself to cancel the reservation, and I sat alone at the table for two, while couples around me laughed and toasted and shared stories about their lives. And I drank 2 glasses of whiskey back to back because I couldn't stand the humiliation of sitting there knowing she had chosen her career and her boss over the man who had stood by her through everything. I stared at my phone waiting for a message that never came until an hour later when she sent a single text saying she had an emergency dinner with the team and she would make it up to me later. And I read the message over and over until the words blurred because it was a final confirmation that I was no longer her priority and I was no longer her partner. I was no longer even necessary in the story she was writing about her new life. I left the restaurant feeling like a fool, and I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached because I couldn't believe I had spent years sacrificing my dreams to support hers only to be abandoned like an old tool she no longer needed. And I couldn't understand how someone could erase 5 years of shared memories with the same ease she used to delete spam emails. When I walked into the house, she didn't even notice I was there because she was packing her suitcase for the trip while talking on the phone and laughing softly at something her boss said, because I recognized his voice through thin walls, and I stood there frozen, watching her smile in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in years, and I realized I was already erased from her world, and she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She ended the call and looked at me as if I had intruded into her space, and she asked if I could water the plants while she was away and make sure the trash went out on Friday, because she wouldn't have time to deal with it, and I felt something inside me snap, because I realized I had been reduced to a caretaker in my own home while she prepared a little life where I no longer existed. That night, I didn't sleep because I couldn't stop replaying every moment where I had ignored the signs and excused her behavior and defended her choices to family and friends who had tried to warn me, and I felt an anger building in my chest, so cold and steady it scared me, because it wasn't loud or explosive, but quiet and deliberate, like a man who had finally reached the end of his patience. I woke up on the morning of our anniversary and saw her post before I even got out of bed, and my stomach twisted as I stared at the photo of her in a white dress on the beach with her boss, holding her waist while a group of people cheered behind them, because she had not only destroyed our marriage, but had broadcasted it for the world to see, as if humiliating me publicly was part of her celebration, and I couldn't understand how. She had the audacity to tag me in the post, knowing every client, every friend, every family member who followed me would now see her betrayal in real time. I sat on the edge of the bed gripping my phone and reading her caption over and over where she wrote, "Married my best friend today, goodbye to my boring life." And I felt my jaw tighten because she reduced our years together to a single phrase of dismissal that mocked the life I worked tirelessly to build while she climbed over my devotion like a ladder to reach someone she thought could give her more. I didn't allow myself to cry because there was no space left for tears, only a growing sense of resolve that filled my chest as I took screenshots of the photo to caption the comments from her friends who congratulated her with hearts and champagne emojis. And I sent each image to a new folder I labeled proof because I knew that from this moment forward, everything had to be methodical and I couldn't afford a single misstep. I called my oldest friend, who was also my lawyer, and I kept my voice steady as I told him what had happened and asked him what my first move should be. And when he told me to meet him in his office, that evening I agreed without hesitation because I realized the only way to recover from this was to go on the offensive before she could take more from me. The hours between that call and the meeting felt endless, but I spent them wisely by going through every financial record, every account, every document I could access. And I made a list of all our shared assets and liabilities because I refused to let her touch a single cent more of what I had earned through years of labor while she played the victim's story, where she was the one holding the knife. I called the bank and froze our joint accounts and canceled every credit card extension in her name because I didn't care if she was embarrassed in some boutique in Cancun when her car was declined, because she had already taken everything from me that mattered, and I would not give her the satisfaction of taking my money too. I called a locksmith and arranged for the locks to be changed before she returned, because I wanted her to feel the same helplessness and exclusion I felt every night she stayed in hotel rooms with him while I sat alone in the house we had built together, believing she was working late. And I knew this was only the first step in dismantling the false sense of security she had created for herself. I drove to my lawyer's office as the sun went down, and when I handed him my phone with the screenshots, his eyebrows raised, but he didn't ask unnecessary questions, because he understood what kind of war I was about to enter, and he began drafting a plan that included freezing all marital assets, filing for divorce on the grounds of adultery, and preparing a restraining order to prevent her from re-entering the home she had abandoned. both physically and emotionally. He reminded me that the house was in my name alone because I had purchased it years before we married, and that meant legally she had no right to step foot inside unless I allowed it. And I felt a surge of relief because it meant I could take control of at least one part of the life she had upended with her selfishness and deceit. When I left his office that night, I felt lighter not because the pain had subsided, but because I had a plan, and for the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to her choices, but making my own, and I promised myself I would not rest until she felt the full weight of the consequences she had unleashed with her reckless betrayal. I arrived home that night and walked straight to the garage because I didn't want to sit in the living room where every corner reminded me of her laughter that now sounded like mockery, and I gathered a stack of cardboard boxes from the storage shelf, because I knew that every single thing she had left behind needed to be removed from this house before she could return and pretend that nothing had changed because I would not let her rewrite the story into one where I begged her to stay. I started with her closet because it was the most obvious symbol of how far she had drifted from the life we once shared, and I pulled down each designer dress, each pair of expensive shoes, each bag she bought with money she claimed she was saving for our future, and I folded them methodically without anger because I refused to give her the satisfaction of imagining me destroying the things she treasured more than the vows we had exchanged 5 years earlier. I labeled each box with her name in thick black marker because I wanted it to be clear that these were no longer possessions shared in a marriage, but property belonging to someone who had chosen to live elsewhere, and I stacked them in neat rows by the garage door because I wanted the first thing she saw upon her return to be the physical manifestation of her own decision to leave. My phone began vibrating late in the afternoon with calls from an unknown number I recognized as hers because she had no reason to call from anything else, and I didn't answer because I didn't want to hear her voice dripping with false concern or feigned confusion, and I watched as each missed call was followed by messages that grew increasingly frantic from, "Why is my car declined?" to, "What are you doing?" and finally to, "You'll regret this." And I saved every single message and screenshot them because I knew they could later serve as evidence of her manipulation and lack of remorse. I moved next to the guest room where she had been sleeping for months because she claimed my snoring kept her awake, when in reality she had used that excuse to create a separate life within our home, and I gathered her toiletries, her skincare, her perfume bottles, still half full, and I placed them gently in another box because I didn't need to destroy her belongings to prove how completely I had erased her presence from this space. I paused only once when I found the small wooden box I had carved for our anniversary still unopened on a nightstand because it reminded me of how far I had fallen in her eyes and how little she valued the pieces of myself I had offered her, and I dropped it into a box without hesitation because she deserved to see that even my most personal creations were now nothing more than items to be packed and removed. By the time the sun had gone down, I had filled 37 boxes and arranged them in perfect order in the garage, like a monument to the end of a marriage that had died long before she posted her smiling betrayal for the world to see, and I felt no satisfaction, only a cold certainty that I was finally taking control of my life in a way that would leave her with no path back. As the evening stretched into night, my phone continued to light up with new attempts to reach me, each one more desperate than the last, and I watched without responding because I no longer owed her explanations or reassurances or apologies, and each unanswered call felt like a small victory in a war I had been forced to fight because she had chosen her boss over the man who built a life for her with his own hands. When the locksmith arrived just before midnight, I greeted him briefly and let him work without speaking because I knew that once the locks were changed, she would be cut off from the home she had once claimed as hers, and I didn't care how she would react when her key no longer turned in the door because she had surrendered every right to this house the moment she chose to kiss another man in front of an audience and call it love. By the time I went to bed that night, the house felt different, not because it was empty, but because it was finally mine again, and I slept with a quiet mind for the first time in years, because I knew that tomorrow she would come home to a world she no longer controlled and realize too late that the life she threw away would not be waiting for her to reclaim. I heard the sound of a taxi pulling up outside, and I knew immediately she was back earlier than planned because the retreat must have ended in chaos after her boss discarded her like an accessory he no longer needed, and I stood in the hallway listening to her heels on the pavement as she fumbled with her key, and I stayed silent because I wanted her to feel the full weight of discovering she no longer had access to the life she had thrown away so easily. I heard the sharp metallic sound of her key turning unsuccessfully in the lock again and again until her frustration turned into impatience, and she rang the doorbell repeatedly as if she could force her way back into a home she no longer belonged to, and I waited for her to escalate, because I knew this would be the moment she realized she was powerless for the first time in years, and I was prepared to let her drown in that realization, without lifting a finger to save her. When she began pounding on the door with her fist, shouting my name with a tone that shifted from fake sweetness to barely concealed rage, I took a deep breath and moved toward the door, not because I intended to open it fully, but because I wanted her to see my face long enough to understand she had no leverage left and the man she used to manipulate was no longer standing on the other side. I slid the security chain into place and opened the door just wide enough for her to see me, but not enough for her to force her way inside. And the look in her eyes as they darted between confusion and outrage told me everything I needed to know about how little she had expected consequences for her actions, and I watched her lips move rapidly as she demanded answers that I refused to give because I no longer owed her the courtesy of a response. She tried to push the door harder when she realized the locks had been changed, and her voice rose with threats about how I couldn't do this to her because she was my wife and she deserved to come back to her home after a long trip. And I stood there unmoving, because I wanted her to understand fully that her status as my wife had been revoked the moment she posted her betrayal for the world to applaud. I raised my hand, holding a printed copy of her beach wedding post, and pressed it against a small opening in the door, so she could see her own smiling face kissing her boss while champagne glasses clinked in the background, and her eyes widened in horror as she took a step back, because the evidence of her betrayal was staring directly at her, and there was no room left for denial or excuses. She began pleading, then saying it was all a misunderstanding and some kind of drunken joke at the retreat meant to entertain the team, and I felt a cold satisfaction, knowing that every word out of her mouth was an attempt to rewrite the truth, because she was terrified of losing the comfortable life I had provided while she played house with another man on a beach hundreds of miles away. I kept my voice even and deliberate as I informed her that her belongings were packed in 37 labeled boxes neatly stacked in the garage, and she had exactly 1 hour to arrange for a moving service to collect them before I donated everything to charity, because I refused to allow her to cross this threshold again or pretend that her betrayal could be erased with crocodile tears and empty promises. When I closed the door slowly in her face, her muffled scream of outrage was followed by the sound of her fist hitting the wood repeatedly, and I walked away without looking back, because I wanted to know the man she thought she could manipulate indefinitely had vanished, and in his place was someone who would not hesitate to cut her out completely no matter how much she begged or threatened. Her final words came through the door in a venomous whisper that promised I would regret this, and I smiled to myself, because the only thing I regretted was not seeing her true nature sooner. And as her footsteps retreated down the driveway, I felt the first flicker of freedom in years, knowing that from this moment forward, every decision would be mine and mine alone. The next morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the list of accounts and assets my lawyer had sent me when I heard another knock at the door, and for a brief moment, I thought she had returned to beg or threatened her way back into my life. But when I checked the peephole, I saw a woman I had never met standing with a folder in her hands, and a look that told me she was not here by accident, and I opened the door just enough to hear her introduce herself as the wife of the man my wife had kissed so publicly on that beach. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation and placed the folder on the table with deliberate precision, because she wanted me to understand she was not here for sympathy or small talk, but to propose an alliance that would take down the two people who had shattered both our lives without remorse. And I listened as she explained how she had been gathering evidence for months because she suspected her husband was using company funds to finance his affairs, and the moment she saw that Instagram post, she knew it was time to act. She opened the folder and showed me copies of hotel receipts, emails, and credit card statements that documented every step of their affair, from private dinners billed as business meetings to luxury gifts purchased with corporate money. And I felt my jaw tighten as I saw my wife's name appear again and again as the recipient of trips and jewelry, while I had been at home fixing leaking pipes and sanding cabinets, believing she was working late to secure her promotion. The other woman told me she had held back from confronting her husband earlier because she wanted to gather enough proof to ruin him in court, and now that her husband and my wife had handed her public evidence of bigamy and fraud, she intended to destroy them both without mercy, and I could see in her eyes the same cold determination I had felt building inside me over the past 3 days. I nodded without speaking because there was nothing to say, and we both understood that our alliance was not built on friendship or shared pain, but on a mutual need for revenge and justice that would leave them stripped of everything they had stolen from us. And I agreed to share all my evidence with her, including the screenshots of the Instagram post, and the messages my wife had sent in a panic after discovering she was locked out. She outlined her plan step by step with a clarity that made it clear she had been preparing for this moment long before I ever entered the picture. And she promised to provide her legal team support in exchange for my sworn testimony about my wife's betrayal. And I realized this was no longer just a divorce, but a coordinated assault that would leave our spouses disgraced in their careers and vulnerable to criminal charges. As we finalized the first phase of our plan, my phone buzzed with another message from my wife that read, "You're making a mistake. We can fix this, just let me in." And I ignored it because she had made her choice and now I was making mine. And I took a deep breath, knowing that the next time she saw my name, it would be on a legal notice that would dismantle whatever fantasy life she thought she had secured with her boss. By the time the other woman left my house that morning, we had agreed on timelines for filing lawsuits and submitting evidence to Company A's board of directors, because exposing the affair and financial misconduct simultaneously would ensure neither of them had time to recover or build a defense. And I felt a calm resolve settle over me as I realized there was no turning back from what we were about to unleash. I spent the rest of the day gathering every document my lawyer might need, including tax returns, property deeds, and marriage certificates, because I wanted the case to be airtight, and I wanted the judge to see clearly that I was not the man who walked into that restaurant alone on our anniversary, but someone who had been reborn through betrayal and was now prepared to demolish the rotten structure my wife had built around her lies. As I sent the last batch of scanned documents to my lawyer, I thought about how ironic it was that she had accused me of being boring and predictable, because she would never have predicted that the man she left behind would be the one to orchestrate the collapse of her new life before it even began, and I felt no pity, only a quiet anticipation for the day she would finally realize there was no one left to save her. The first wave of our plan began the following Monday when my lawyer filed an aggressive divorce petition citing adultery, abandonment, and intentional emotional harm supported by the public evidence my wife had foolishly provided. And at the same time, the boss's wife delivered a formal complaint to Company A's board of directors attaching proof of corporate fraud and misconduct, which sent shockwaves through the upper management because they realized their trusted executive had used company funds to finance a personal affair. As the legal documents were served to my wife's temporary address at her mother's house, I received dozens of notifications from mutual acquaintances forwarding her cryptic social media posts where she painted herself as a victim of an oppressive marriage, claiming she had finally broken free to reclaim her life. But I knew these were deliberate attempts to rewrite the narrative before the court could hear the truth, and I saved every single one as evidence of her bad faith. The boss's wife called later that afternoon to inform me that Company A had placed her husband on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, and she confirmed that he had already begun blaming my wife for everything, claiming she had manipulated him into the relationship and orchestrated the beach wedding to trap him, and I felt a grim satisfaction knowing he was throwing her under the bus to save himself, just as she had once thrown away our marriage to chase his approval. By Tuesday, my wife's lawyer contacted mine requesting an urgent meeting to discuss settlement terms, but we refused because I was determined to let the full weight of the court process crush her carefully constructed image, and I instructed my lawyer to demand a division of assets that left her with nothing because almost everything had been acquired before the marriage, and I refused to reward betrayal with comfort. When the board of directors at Company A concluded their investigation later that week, they terminated both my wife and her boss, citing violations of company policy and ethical misconduct, and I received a forwarded copy of the internal memo announcing their dismissals with language so cold and impersonal it read like an obituary for their careers, and I felt no pity because they had built their entire relationship on lies and arrogance, only to watch it collapse in a single stroke. I watched silently as my wife's friends posted supportive comments on her social media, accusing me of being controlling and jealous, while she liked each one as if collecting allies for a battle she had already lost, and I sent screenshots of those posts to my lawyer, knowing they would strengthen our argument that she had deliberately attempted to damage my reputation in the community. By Friday, my wife had begun calling from multiple numbers, leaving voice messages that ranged from begging me to take her back to threatening me with vague legal action, and I forwarded every single one to my lawyer, without responding because I refused to give her even the satisfaction of hearing my voice, and each ignored call felt like another step toward erasing her from my life entirely. When the boss's wife confirmed she had filed her own lawsuit for divorce custody and financial restitution, I realized we had created a perfect storm that neither of them could escape. Because while my wife and her boss had been celebrating their new life on a beach, they had underestimated the people they left behind, and now those people were stripping away every comfort they thought they deserved. I spent my evenings reviewing documents with my lawyer and preparing witness statements because I refused to let her rewrite history in a courtroom the way she had done on Instagram. And I reminded myself over and over that this was not about revenge, but about reclaiming my dignity and ensuring she faced consequences for the years of deceit that had left me humiliated in front of family, friends, and clients. By the end of the week, I felt the shift completely as my role changed from betrayed husband trying to understand what went wrong to the architect of a strategy designed to demolish every advantage she had built at my expense. And I promised myself I would not stop until there was nothing left of the life she had tried to build on the ashes of mine. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I walked into a room with my lawyer at my side, carrying a binder filled with months of evidence, while my wife sat across from me with a new lawyer she could barely afford, and her mother clutching her hand like a lifeline, because they both knew this was her last chance to salvage anything from the wreckage she had created with her own betrayal. Her lawyer opened with a speech painting her as a young woman trapped in a suffocating marriage to a man who stifled her ambitions and dreams, and he claimed she had been manipulated into a relationship with her boss out of desperation for validation because she felt invisible at home, and I listened without reacting because I knew every word was a rehearsed performance designed to extract pity from a judge who had already reviewed the evidence. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with trembling hands and a voice deliberately breaking at key moments as she declared she still loved me and begged for forgiveness, claiming the beach wedding was a harmless joke meant to amuse her colleagues. And I felt a surge of disgust as she wiped away perfectly timed tears, knowing she was only trying to rewrite her betrayal as a mistake instead of a conscious choice to destroy the life we had built together. She spoke of long nights feeling lonely in our home because I worked late, and claimed she sought comfort in conversations with her boss that became something more only because I had left her emotionally abandoned, and I clenched my fists under the table because I could not believe she had the audacity to blame me for her decision to stand on a beach kissing another man while tagging me in a post designed to humiliate me in front of everyone I knew. When my lawyer presented our case, he moved with the precision of a surgeon, laying out each piece of evidence from screenshots of her posts to text messages where she admitted her relationship with her boss to financial statements, showing she had benefited from luxury trips funded by corporate accounts. And he reminded the court that I had been the sole provider for most of our marriage while she diverted her attention and affection to someone else without remorse. I took the stand with calm voice and stated only the facts because I knew emotions would not win this battle. And I told the judge that my wife voluntarily left the marital home, engaged in a public relationship with her superior, and used our anniversary to finalize her exit from a marriage while broadcasting her betrayal to mutual acquaintances with no regard for the psychological harm it caused. And I saw the judge's expression harden with every word. My wife's mother glared at me from a gallery, whispering accusations of cruelty and ingratitude as if I had been the one who betrayed vows, and I ignored her because I refused to let a woman who had raised such selfishness distract me from the outcome I came to achieve, which was complete severance in the person who had already replaced me before the marriage officially ended. When the judge delivered her ruling, she spoke firmly and without hesitation, granting the divorce in my favor on grounds of adultery and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and she denied my wife's request for spousal support, citing her blatant bad faith in abandoning the marriage and engaging in conduct that caused public humiliation and professional damage to her husband, and I felt no joy, only a deep sense of justice. As the words were read aloud, the division of assets was settled in minutes because almost everything had been acquired before the marriage, and the little she had contributed during our years together was offset by debts in her name, leaving her with nothing but the cardboard boxes I had stacked in the garage weeks earlier, and I saw the tears in her eyes change from performative to real as she realized the finality of what she had lost. As I walked out of the courthouse, my phone buzzed with a message from the boss's wife, confirming that her own case was moving forward and that her husband had already been served with fraud charges, which meant my wife's new life had collapsed before it even began, and I stepped into the street knowing this was the end of her story in my life and the beginning of mine without her. I spent the weeks after the court ruling closing accounts tied to her name, canceling every lingering connection we had, and meeting with real estate agents to list the house, because I refused to continue living in a space where every corner reminded me of sacrifices I had made for a person who had traded loyalty for luxury without hesitation. And I signed the papers with a steady hand, because I knew letting go of the house was the final act of severing ties to a past that had already been burned to the ground. As I packed my remaining belongings into a moving truck, I ignored the new wave of messages from her that alternated between desperate pleas to reconcile and venomous accusations that I had ruined her life, because I no longer needed to engage with a woman who had willingly destroyed her marriage and then expected me to preserve her comfort after she had publicly mocked a man who built everything she enjoyed. She had moved back in with her mother and was working a menial job she despised because no company in the industry would hire someone with a termination for misconduct and a pending fraud investigation tied to her name, and I learned from mutual acquaintances that her former friends had begun to distance themselves once it became clear she was no longer connected to the power and money they once admired. The boss's wife called me one final time to inform me that her divorce had been finalized and her ex-husband had pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for avoiding prison, but lost his professional licenses and assets in the process. And we agreed that our alliance had achieved its purpose, because the people who thought they could discard us without consequence now faced lives stripped of wealth status and influence. I bought a small plot of land on the outskirts of town and began sketching plans for a modest house, because I wanted to build something entirely my own with no ghosts on the walls and no memories of betrayal. And I worked late into the evenings pouring concrete and framing walls, because each nail hammered was a declaration that my life belonged to me again. Javier and my lawyer visited on a quiet Saturday, bringing beer and helping me install kitchen cabinets while we talked about everything and nothing, because these were the people who had stayed when everyone else had taken sides or disappeared, and I realized they were the true foundation of my life, stronger than any relationship built on fragile promises. Months later, I learned that my ex-wife's criminal case had ended with a conviction for fraud and a suspended sentence because the court accepted her claim that she had been manipulated by her boss, but the record would follow her for years, and I felt no pity because she had willingly chosen her path, and now she was forced to walk it alone without the support of the man she had betrayed or the one she thought would replace him. I looked back only once when I saw her standing outside my old house weeks after the sale with a plastic bag in her hand, staring at the front door like she expected it to open, and I watched from my truck as she turned and walked away, shoulders slumped and steps unsteady, because it was clear even to her that she had no place left in the world she had helped destroy. The first night in my new house, I slept soundly without the weight of unanswered questions or suppressed anger, because I had demolished the old life down to its foundations and rebuilt something that could not be taken from me by someone else's selfishness. And I woke up knowing the future was entirely mine to shape without interference from people who saw love as a transaction to be renegotiated at their convenience. I woke up in my new house months after everything had ended, and I lay in bed thinking about how a life I once believed was permanent had crumbled so completely because one person decided that loyalty and sacrifice were worth less than status and attention, and I reminded myself that every decision I made since then had been about taking back control from someone who thought she could humiliate me without consequence and move on as if I was disposable. I spent my days working on new projects and signing contracts with clients who respected my integrity because my reputation had survived the storm, even as hers was reduced to whispers among former colleagues who now spoke her name only when sharing cautionary tales about ambition unchecked by ethics, and I refused to allow her downfall to define me because I had chosen to rebuild instead of wallow in the destruction she left behind. Every attempt she made to contact me was ignored because I no longer cared about her explanations or apologies or threats, and I had no interest in hearing how she now blamed her former boss for everything, even though she had been a willing participant in every betrayal that cost her her marriage, her career, and her future, because she believed the rules didn't apply to her. When I handed over the keys to the young family who bought the house I built with my own hands, I didn't look back because I knew the memories inside those walls were nothing but anchors tried to pull me into a sea of regret I had already decided to leave behind, and I drove away in silence, knowing I owed her nothing, not even the satisfaction of knowing she still occupied my thoughts. Now I live in a space free of her presence, free of her contempt, free of the double standards that made me feel like a stranger in my own life, and I focus on the people who never betrayed me because they are the true pillars holding up the structure of the man I became after surviving the worst kind of betrayal, and I no longer see her face when I close my eyes because it has been replaced by the plans and dreams I build for myself. I know she will never recover from the destruction she brought upon herself because she believed she could trade love for power and that there would always be someone to catch her when she fell. And I no longer wonder how she feels knowing the man she abandoned was the one who tore apart the illusion she built, because I have stopped caring about people who treat loyalty as a weakness to exploit. When I sit outside in the evenings watching the last light fade, I sometimes think about how much I lost and how much I gained, because losing her was not the end, but the beginning of a life where I answer no one and carry no one's burdens except my own. And I know now that betrayal is not a wound, but a demolition clearing space for something stronger to rise. I take a deep breath, and I know there is nothing left to say because the past is a closed door, and I have no desire to open it again, not for her, not for anyone who thought I would remain broken and waiting for forgiveness she never earned, because I learned that forgiveness is not a gift for those who hurt you, but a decision to stop carrying their weight on your back. I built a new life from the rubble of the old one, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted freedom, and every choice I make now is a reminder that I survived not because I was stronger, but because I refuse to let betrayal be the final word of my story, and I know this is a life I was meant to build all along.